downward. So the more you speculate, you just go deeper into the branches, and you never get to the root of the existence. Why is that? Because the senses are imperfect, we make mistakes, we're easily illusioned, we have a cheating propensity, and so forth. So it's not a viable means of inquiry about the absolute truth. So the absolute truth, or the answer to these metaphysical questions, is found in Vedic scriptures, or let's say in scripture, because in a general way the same absolute truth is explained in the Quran, in the Bible, and other types of religious scriptures, or at least there's hints of it. So therefore, the search for the real knowledge and the truth of existence is elusive. People go off into these speculative tangents, and they, like I said, they get caught in the branches and they never find the root. And this is due to the 4 defects of every human being. Tangents, and they, like I said, they get caught in the branches and they never find the root. First is mistakes, then illusion, then imperfect senses, then cheating propensity. So because we have imperfect senses, it's easy to make mistakes, and it's easy to be illusioned. And most mistakes are due to imperfect hearing and seeing, or tasting, touching, and smelling, by which we accept one thing to be something else. For example, we mistake a rope to be a snake. Then, by doing such a thing, we become subject to illusion. We become afraid, thinking, oh, poisonous snake. Now, an illusion, the definition it probably gives of an illusion is to believe something is true that was never true at any time. So the rope was never a snake at any time. And the body is never the real identity of the human being at any time. So this is what you would call the greatest mistake, or the greatest misconception, is to believe that I am the body. Because the body continually changes during the 6 stages of life. There's birth, there's growth, there's maintenance, there's giving off byproducts, there's deterioration, and then there's death. At every phase of life, in fact, every second of life, the body is changing. So how can you say I am this body? The next question would be, which body are you talking about? Not only that, we all begin microscopically. The sperm of a father carries either a male or female. They're not all male, right? And when the sperm finds its way into the ovum is simply a nutrient sac for the development of the sperm. The sperm is carrying the living entity. Now the sperm, the actual size of the sperm is 0.002 inches long. In other words, the only thing you can see, you only begin to see things with a microscope at 0.0039 inches. So the sperm is half the size of what you can begin to see with a microscope. So therefore, you can't even see it. But that is carrying the living entity. And this is very, as soon as it connects to the ovum is something you can actually see with the naked eye. It's big enough to see with the naked eye. It looks like a speck, but you can see it. And as soon as they conjugate, then growth begins. But from the conception in the womb, meaning the sperm-ovum union, the human being begins to grow. It becomes first a fetus, and then it's pushed out as a child, and then the child becomes pushed out as a baby, then the baby becomes a child, and adolescence, then adulthood, then middle age, then old age, and death. This is called the cycle of life, during which the body dramatically changes at every stage. However, the person within the body, or the observer of the changes, doesn't change. How is that? Well, we can remember. In the past, I had a little body like this, and now I have a big body like that. The fact that you can remember means that you are a unique person. You're different than what you're observing. The object of the senses, or sense perception, is different than the sense perceiver. If you were the same thing, you would not be the seer, and what you're seeing would not be the object. So, if I can see something, then what I see is not me. I am the seer, and the object is seen by the process of seeing. So all of these three things are supplied to us by somebody else. I didn't create myself. I didn't create the object I'm seeing. I didn't create the process of seeing. So there's someone else involved in all this, or there's some superior intelligence involved. And we have to ask, who set up this system? Sperm, ovum, womb, birth, growth, maintenance, giving off byproducts, deterioration, old age, disease, death. Who set this process up? I'm just going along with it, and it's forced on me. Therefore, there's someone else that's organizing, who organized this process. So, it's very complicated, and using imperfect senses to speculate about this will not lead to any positive conclusion, because you're dealing with things you can't see. You're dealing with processes that existed before you. You're dealing with a process in which you're forced to do things. And all along we have imperfect senses and so forth. So mere speculation and limited experimentation will never lead to understanding the real nature of what's going on. Now, if a person begins merely observing what's happening and tries to reason to the origin of these things, they end up with mysticism, with mystic powers, beyond their scope of perception or understanding. So the Vedas explained that the real size of the soul is 1/10,000th the tip of a hair. It's explained in the Svatara Upanishad. Well, 1/10,000th, that's even smaller than an atom. So now the dimensions are far away from anything we could even perceive. We can't even see an atom. And now we're talking about something smaller than the atom, and that's us. So we're running into this vast, let's say, cloud of mysticism, mystic power that's beyond our scope of perception or even understanding. So we can understand the description of the size of the soul, 1/10,000th the tip of a hair, but we can't measure it. In other words, someone else has measured it. That's why we're reading the description. It's in the Vedas. But it's something that we can't measure because it's beyond our scope of measurement or perception. Now, on the other hand, although we can't see it, we can't measure it, we can perceive its presence in the form of consciousness. And how do we know the consciousness is coming from something so small that we can't see? Well, you compare a person who's living and then they die. And as soon as they die, something is missing. It's consciousness. And you can't bring the consciousness back once they're dead. because it's not a combination of chemicals or material elements or nutrients. You can pump the body all you want with chemicals, nutrients. You could measure all the chemicals before the person dies, and then measure all the chemicals or analyze all the chemicals after they die. If there's something missing, you could pump it in, but the person won't come back alive. So there's something non-material that's missing in the dead body. And it's something mysterious. It's so small we can't see it, but we can see its effect, consciousness. And we can see its effect when consciousness is not there. Meaning something left the body that we can't measure. And people weigh the body before death and after death. And usually what happens is, for some time after death, the weight is less. And then the weight increases. So it's very confusing if you simply weigh it. So that's why I say we're dealing with things that we can't see. They're beyond our sense of perception, our sense of measurement, but yet we know something is there. And if we read Vedas, or especially Bhagavad Gita, then we can begin to understand. First of all, consciousness is not made of a combination of material elements or chemicals. And it's a non-material phenomenon. The soul's presence in the body is a non-material phenomenon. And this is confirmed by Krishna. He says, that which pervades the entire body you should know to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy that imperishable soul. In Bhagavad Gita 2:17. So you can't see the soul, but you know it's present by consciousness. The body minus consciousness is dead, which means the soul is no longer present. The body, therefore, is simply a material vehicle, like a car. And it's driven by a soul. The material body vehicle moves because there's a soul present in the heart, and all the energies for bodily movement emanate from the heart of the living being. Blood corpuscles, for example, cells which carry oxygen from the lungs, receive energy from the soul. If the soul leaves the body at death, the production of blood cells ceases. And there's no more energy in the body. So the average rate of blood cell production is 200 billion per day. And that's just blood cells. There are other things also being produced every day, which totals about a pint of blood a week in the human body. This is a mysterious and incredible natural process. No one has been able to produce blood artificially, even till today. Scientists cannot steadily produce blood. They can perhaps produce a blood, something that looks like blood and acts a little bit like blood, but it's not equal to human blood. And
I met some Indian origin person in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
He has so many patents.
Yeah.
He's a multi-millionaire. So he Rath Yatra every year for the last 30 years. He from Northern California, somewhere he flies in his own chopper and comes to decorate the car. So he was telling me his patent where he manufactured artificial blood that the U.S. Army uses for soldiers for like on battlefield for currency.
Really?
It's not, as you say, it almost it serves a purpose. It's not real blood, but
Yeah. Yeah, they can, and in very small quantities, they can make it. They can make something that looks and acts a little bit like blood, but you can't like take out the real blood and put that in. The person would die. But it can help with some in some cases, not all cases, in some cases, because there are blood types also, right? So. And by the way, they haven't really tested it. They're testing it on the soldiers, but they haven't really tested it, and it's not available to the public. That's the problem with joining the American Army. They test on you.
Trump was smart.
Huh?
Was smart. He got away with it.
Well,
Drafting.
yeah. Yeah. Well, not only him, a lot of others. Bush also and others. Of course, Billy Clinton never even got close. Bush at least entered the National Guard. You know, he didn't even. He just went to Europe. You know, forgot about it. So, the mystery of blood production, as well as the attempt to create life from chemicals or dead matter, has perplexed scientists. And producing blood from human blood stem cells is a process beginning with living cells. By the way, you can produce small quantities of blood from stem cells. They don't start from dead chemicals, right? So that's another proof that life comes from life. It doesn't come from dead chemicals. They don't start with dead chemicals or dead.
Science has never been able to explain the theory of meanings.
Meanings of what?
How your mind perceives meaning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There's no equivalent because meanings are contextual. They are referential.
Yeah.
There are all these attributes to it. Like if you look at a red light as a signal.
Yeah.
You know, science is just telling it's a particular frequency, but the mind interprets that in this context it means I need to stop, right? So.
Oh, by the way, the first driverless bus legally got on the road in California. In 1 hour, it had an accident. In less than an hour, it had an accident. It's just happened this week. The first driverless bus. In other words, you know. Like it's very related to what you just said. You know, it can maybe pick up the frequency of light, but it doesn't necessarily understand immediately that they should stop. Or, you know, anyway, there's going to be a lot of problems with artificial intelligence. A lot of problems. So, the mystery of how matter is transformed into living cells is beyond the scope of observation and experimentation, because the living entity is non-material, not a material thing, and non-material living entity that seems to give life and consciousness to matter, although matter itself is dead. So it only looks alive because the soul is present. You take the soul out, it dies immediately. So the dimension of living entity is beyond the scope of the scientist's perception. Therefore, they cannot understand the mystery, although they can see the effect, life and consciousness. So that's the point. As soon as they go to origin of things, they end up with mystic power that they can't understand.
There's a concept of Turing's theorem, which
Yes.
says that for randomly created systems,
Yeah.
there are three possibilities. Systems that don't even come about,
Yes.
crash to begin with.
Yeah.
Systems that come about, but eventually they get destroyed or die.
Yeah.
And third is systems that are perpetual. So the argument is that if you say that life is created randomly, then there should be at least some life forms or individual living beings that never die.
Right.
Right, because all three possibilities should be. When you talk about randomness, it should cover the entire spectrum of randomness. But the very fact that you don't see living entities who never die, that means they should not have been randomly created.
Interesting. Where does that explain?
So Turing's theorem doesn't talk about the counter argument to it. He's just saying that that there's three possibilities, but the creationists, they are arguing or making the point that if that is true, if you're saying that life forms are randomly created, then where is the third possibility? You don't see any living entity that never died. That means then there is no. If it's really random, then that why is the third possibility?
Oh, they could say the third possibility is a stem cell. The stem cell produces other stem cells, and it just keeps going on and on. As long as you produce, as long as you keep the nutrient base
So that's maybe true at a species level, but when you talk about specific living,
The specific stem cell itself will, yeah, it's going to die. Yeah. Okay. So now we're talking about the individual soul. Now, if we talk about the Paramatma, which was subject, the Paramatma is the soul of the soul. It's even smaller than the soul, which is 1/10,000th the tip of a hair. So now we get into a more mystical or mystic power. And Krishna explains this, that the super soul is in the heart of every living being. And inside of every material atom. So, ekopyaso rachayitam jagadanda kotim yachaktir asti jagadanda chayayadanta andantarasta paramanu chayantarastam govindamari purusham tamaham bhajami. He, the Lord, is an undifferentiated entity, as there is no distinction between potency and the possessor thereof. In his work of creation, in other words, he is the energetic and the energy. In his work of creation of millions of worlds, his potency remains inseparable. All the universes exist in him, and he is present in his fullness in every one of the atoms that are scattered throughout the universe at one and the same time. Such is the primeval Lord whom I adore. So he's present in every atom. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has given the following commentary on this verse. He says, Krishna is the highest of all entities. In him is an entity which is termed Chit, spiritual, which is distinct from the principle of limitation. This is a very important statement. We'll come back to it. By his inconceivable power, he can at will create numberless universes. All the mundane universes owe their origin to the transformation of his external potency. Again, his abode is beyond human conception. Since all worlds, limited and spiritual, or Chit, exist in him, he resides simultaneously in his fullness and entirety, in all the atoms in all the worlds. In other words, God is present in his fullness and entirety in every atom of the universe. This is a very, let's say, difficult principle to understand, or fact to understand. All pervasiveness is only a localized aspect of the majesty of Krishna. In other words, he's all pervasive not only as Paramatma, he's also all pervasive as Brahmajyoti. And is also all-pervasive as the universal form that contains everything. So here, it says all-pervasiveness is only a localized aspect of the majesty of Krishna, the Lord of all. Though he is all-pervasive, yet in his existence, everywhere, in a medium shape, consists his spiritual lordship over beyond human conception. In other words, medium shape means as Paramatma, which is supposed to be the size of a thumb, maximum 4 or 5 inches. This argument, well, he's less than microscopic, but yet he has a body that is like a thumb, like 3 or 4 inches. The argument favors a doctrine of simultaneous, inconceivable distinction and non-distinction, meaning achintya beta beta tattva, and knocks down the contaminating Mayavada and other allied doctrines. In other words, Mayavadis are perplexed and defeated by this one verse in Brahma Samhita 5:35. Yeah. Actually, it's smaller than the atom. It's smaller than the soul also. but it can manifest like that in the heart. This mystery of Lord Krishna's expansion as the Supersoul, present in every atom of the universe, explains why the material creation is self-sustaining regardless of whatever human beings do. There are many cycles in nature that attest to the superior intelligence and control of Krishna. For example, there are 3 fundamental cycles that maintain the Earth's ecosystem and balance of the ecosystem. And they are the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Like the water cycle, there's water in the ocean, and it's evaporated by the sun, it forms clouds. Then the clouds are pushed by the wind, and they go over land and other places. And then when there's a difference between temperature, the little droplets of water that are dispersed, they come together and the cloud becomes heavy, and then rain falls on the, it can come as rain, or it can come as snow or ice, and it falls, let's say, on the mountains, it freezes, then in the wintertime, then in springtime, the sun heats up the ice and snow, and then it melts, and it comes down the mountain, forms streams and rivers. The rivers flow gradually back to the ocean, and so that's the water cycle. And all life depends on that water cycle. And water purifies things also. And then there's the carbon cycle, and then the nitrogen cycle. So these cycles work together to carry away waste materials and replenish the Earth's ecosystem with nutrients to sustain life. If there is any disruption or imbalance of these 3 cycles, it would be disastrous for sustaining life on this planet. Now, there's another cycle. It's called the karma cycle. There are actually many cycles. We're going to explain them now. There are other cycles in nature, such as the phosphorus cycle, the climate cycle, phosphorus cycle, the climate cycle, the oxygen cycle, the sulfur climate, oxygen cycle, the sulfur cycle, the rock cycle, and the menstrual cycle. They're all cycles, and life depends on them. And there are many more known and unknown cycles that mysteriously sustain and energize life on the earth. They also mysteriously work together, which attests to superior intelligence-based coordination. They're working together, all these complex cycles. That means that somebody extremely intelligent created these cycles and is maintaining them. And actually it's only possible because of the presence of the Supersoul, Lord Krishna's expansion. Not only is the Lord present in every atom of the universe, He's also present in the heart of every living being. And He's also directing the wanderings of everyone. This means that the Lord helps every living being to act. It's similar to a car manufacturer who builds a machine that is capable to be driven. The manufacturer makes the car capable to be driven by a person according to his desires to go somewhere. Similarly, the Lord supplies a vehicle to every living being so that he can perform the functions of life such as eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. And this is explained in the Vedas. Anor aniyam mahato mahiyan atmasya jantun hito guhayam tam akratu pasyati vita soko datu prasadan mahimanam atmanam. Both the Supersoul, Paramatma, and the atomic soul, Jivatma, are situated in the same tree of the body within the same heart of the living entity, of the living being. And only one who has become free from all material desires as well as lamentations, can, by the grace of the Supreme, understand the glories of the soul. So as long as we are lamenting and desiring, we'll never understand anything. Those two conditions, and one has to rise above those two conditions in order to understand what's going on. Desiring and lamenting. Sochati and kangsati. Sochati means lamenting, and kangsati means desiring. So Krishna expands as the Paramatma in the heart of every living entity. And he's smaller than the soul of the living being because he's present as the soul of the soul. And each living entity in whichever material body he may have at present, including human beings, animals, insects, reptiles, birds, aquatics, plants, etc., we're all originally souls in the spiritual world. But somehow, some living entities chose to separate themselves from Lord Krishna due to their desires to dominate and exploit and enjoy material nature, independent of God, independent of Krishna. This desire is the cause of a fall down of the living entity from his constitutional position as the eternal servant of Krishna. And then, according to their desires to dominate and enjoy nature, they're placed in one of the 8.4 million species of life to begin the cycle of karma. So the karma, we're discussing now the karma cycle. There are many cycles, and the karma cycle is one of them. And this karma cycle is due to the material consciousness by which a person desires to be an independent enjoyer rather than the servant of God. And due to this mentality, he goes up or down in the cycle of karma through the different species of material life, with his eternal soul entrapped in a temporary material body. In every species, the Lord accompanies the living entity by being present within the heart. And Krishna explains this in Bhagavad Gita 13:23. Upadastana mantracha partabhokta maheswara paramatmeti chapiyukto dehesmin purushakpura. 13:23. He says, yet in this body there's another transcendental enjoyer who's the Lord, the supreme proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the Supersoul. So Krishna is present in the heart. He's the transcendental enjoyer. He's the supreme proprietor. He's the overseer, the permitter, and he's known as the Supersoul. So he's present within the heart to permit the individual soul's ability to satisfy his desires. Those desires can be spiritual or they can be material. In both ways, the living entity can't satisfy them without the help of the Lord. And without the permission of the Lord, the living entity can't do anything. Why? Because we are all being sustained, and Krishna is the sustainer and maintainer. So, 5,000 years ago, Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita. Why? To enlighten people about the art of work by which they can become free from the cycle of birth and death, or the karma cycle. And Krishna taught Arjuna how to work without incurring any karmic reaction. And this is explained in Bhagavad Gita, in the 4th chapter, where Krishna tells Arjuna, Yoga sanyasta karmanam, jnana sanchina samsayam, atmavantam na karmani, atmavantam na karmani, nibandhananti dhananjaya. So this is a very nice verse, 4th chapter. 41st verse. Krishna says, one who acts in devotional service, yoga sannyasta karmanam, renouncing the fruits of activity, sannyasta karmanam, yoga sannyasta, and jnana sanchina samsayan, and whose doubts have been destroyed by transcendental knowledge. Atmavantam na karmani nibandhananti dhananjaya. Is situated factually in the self. Thus, he's not bound by the reactions of work. O Dhananjaya, O conqueror of riches. So Prabhupada explains in that purport, 441, one who follows the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita as it is imparted by the Lord, the personality of Godhead himself, becomes free from all doubts by the grace of transcendental knowledge. He, as a part and parcel of the Lord, in full Krishna consciousness, is already established in self-knowledge. As such, he is undoubtedly above bondage to action. So, this is Krishna explaining to us how to work without incurring karmic reactions. That's called Yoga Karmasu Koshalam, the art of work. So this work in devotion will liberate a person from the entanglement of the cycle of karma. Karma is the cycle of reactive work. Reactive work means you do something and there's a reaction that keeps you doing more things. You get caught in the cycle of birth and death. But there is a type of work by which you become free from that cycle of birth, death, old age, and disease. And that is the subject of Bhagavad Gita. And Krishna is teaching this art of work. So now, what is really going on in these 8,400,000 species of life is an evolution of consciousness, not an evolution of bodies. All the bodies were created at once by Krishna. Just like so many houses and apartments are being built in Sammamish, and they're empty in the beginning, but then they fill up by people. Some people can afford an apartment, some people can afford a townhouse, some people can afford a condo, some people can afford a house, some people can afford a house with land, and so forth, right? So all those things are existing, and then they get filled up by the ability of people, due to their karma, to be able to live in that particular house. So all the species, 8,400,000, were created in the beginning of time, and they get filled up according to the way people's previous karma, and the way they want to try and dominate and enjoy nature. So there's no evolution of bodies, but there is an evolution of consciousness. Just like in one's own life, our consciousness evolves, right? As a little kid, we explained this yesterday, the consciousness evolves in 5 ways called Brahmapucham. First, one perceives the world as food. In fact, in these little baby calves that are born, they instinctively eat like this. They don't chew, they suck. Right? They instinctively do that, and they're looking for something to suck, like the mother's udder, or a bottle with a rubber, sucker. Or if you put your finger in their mouth, they'll suck your finger. Right? They're born like that. That's instinctual. Right? Krishna, Paramatma, is giving him that knowledge. So, our first level of consciousness is food as God. The second level of consciousness is, that's called Anamoya. And the second level is Pranamoya, seeing the life symptoms. This one is my mommy, this one is my daddy, this one is my uncle, this one is my brother. This is the cat, this is the dog. They see the life symptoms of different entities. Eventually, this is tree, this is that, because they're moving. And then Jnanamoya, they begin to think, feel, and will. They begin to perceive the mental functioning. They begin to act on the mental plane. And then, fourth is Vijnanamoya. They're able to see that there's a difference between the body and the soul, and between something dead and something alive. And then eventually, Anandamoya, by understanding their relationship with Krishna, they become ecstatic eternally. See? So there are 5 stages of consciousness, Brahmapucham, or realization of Brahma, the truth. So there's this evolution of consciousness. That is the real evolution, not evolution of bodies, as Darwin says. So in the human form, especially, there's a possibility to understand how to become free of the karma cycle and go back to the eternal spiritual world. So this is the real destiny of every living entity. Destiny means what you are working towards as the real goal of life. And you're working toward it because you're chanting, you're bowing down, you're hearing. You're building up your destiny, what you will achieve as the real goal of life. And success depends on having enlightened human intelligence to understand the instructions that God has given in Scripture for salvation. So, as long as a person is desiring and lamenting, they can never develop this enlightened human consciousness. Desiring and lamenting. But most people are desiring and lamenting all the time. Would you agree with that, Prabhu? Yeah. So, therefore, even though they might have, good intelligence, they will not understand anything. One has to rise above that. Brahma bhuta prasanatma, na sochati na kangsati, samak sarvesu bhutesu, mad bhaktim lapate param. That Brahma bhuta prasanatma, one who is a liberated soul, is prasanatma, satisfied internally. Satisfied by virtue of acquired knowledge and realization. This is the main theme for satisfaction. Not acquired money or wealth and power. Not wealth and power, but acquired knowledge and realization. Wealth and power are temporary things. Acquired knowledge and realization can be eternal if it's about Krishna, not acquired knowledge about ants and realization that we all come from ants. That's all nonsense, right? But if you have acquired knowledge about the soul and its eternal relationship to Krishna, then that's worth more than wealth and power, because it liberates you from the cycle of birth and death. So the idea now is that false theories are the greatest detriment to advancing in progressively in spiritual enlightenment. False theories. The real principle of liberation is getting free of all false concepts and replacing them with the absolute truth. Then one is free. But as long as we're entertaining false concepts in the mind, we'll never be free. We'll always remain bound up by the cycle of karma. So freedom is given only to enlightened persons who are no longer prisoners of false concepts. The false ego, under the influence of material illusion, and material illusion is pushed by the mind that's uncontrolled, and thinks, I am matter and material acquisitions or material things are mine. These are two, let's say, aspects of false ego. Aham mameti. I am matter, and this belongs to me, that belongs to me. In fact, my goal is to own everything. Right? So, this is the greatest misconception, to think that I am not an eternal soul, temporarily entrapped in a material body. And not to think that God has given me this opportunity in the human form of life to use my intelligence and my senses and body in the service of Krishna and finally liberate myself from the cycle of karma. So, 5 types of ignorance keep us entrenched in these misconceptions. The first principle of ignorance is we forget our real identity, thinking I am the body rather than I am the eternal conscious soul in the temporary body. And then as soon as we develop that foolish thought, we begin to have fear of death. And we have a sense of death and eventually a fear of death. And then from that, we have anger after frustration. We're frustrated. Why should I get old? Why should I die? This is not right. I want to be young. I want to have sense gratification. I want to go here. I want to go there. I want to be rich. I want to have all these riches. I want to enjoy my riches, blah, blah, blah. So one develops anger after this frustration that I'm not immortal, and I'm getting older, I'm getting this thing and that thing. And then one becomes greedier due to this frustration, and they develop this false sense of ownership. See, when people are young, they're not really attached to, they're attached, but not overly attached to material things. But when they get older, they get very attached. In fact, they can't let go of anything. There are people who are experts at collecting junk. My brother, he had half of his house was filled with old newspapers. He never threw them away. He had newspapers going back to the 1940s. I asked him once, why are you keeping them? He said, I refer to them every once in a while. He never referred to any of them. But he couldn't get rid of them. Right? And then there was one doctor that lived in our neighborhood. Before he died, he gave all his books to my brother. He said, you like to read, so you can have all my books. I'm going to die now. So my brother kept them for years. And I looked at the books. They were all junk books, all useless books. And I asked my brother, why are you keeping them? He said, one day I'll read them. He never read one of them, you see. So this begins in when one is a baby. When one is a baby, when they pass stool, they're not disturbed by it, unless they start itching and whatever. But they're not. In fact, they play with it. In fact, they even try and eat it, because they see that as part of them. Then they have to be taught not to play with the stool, not to eat it, not to wallow in it. If you leave the baby alone, it'll just keep passing stool and rolling around in it. Right? So, in the same way that stool, let's say, attachment develops in adulthood, by this false sense of proprietorship. And this is a type of ignorance, profound ignorance. And then after that, one develops, after all this, the forgetfulness of real identity, the sense of death, anger after frustration, and the sense of false ownership. One develops the full-blown material conception of life. And what is that? That the goal of life is sense gratification. That there's no life after death. And therefore, one becomes frenetic. It's a very nice word. F-R-E-N-E-T-I-C. Frenetic means, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So what is the line between sense gratification and the normal use?
No, we explained this already. There is gross sense gratification, and there is spiritual sense gratification. Like, for example, when you eat food that's been offered to Krishna, prasadam, are you pleasing your senses?
First, we are offering it to the Lord.
Yeah.
Then
The Lord offers it back to you. You don't get an empty plate back, right? So when you eat that, are you pleasing your senses?
later on, yes. I overeat a lot of times.
No. It doesn't matter. You overeat or undereat. Are you pleasing your senses? Are you getting satisfaction? Are you getting satiated?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's spiritual sense gratification. Right? You recognizing that Krishna is the first enjoyer, and you're the secondary enjoyer of Krishna's mercy. But you don't really enjoy it in a gross sense, you enjoy it spiritually. And when you chant 16 rounds early in the morning, do you get a sense of satisfaction? You're hesitating, so I assume you're not doing it. But anyway, yeah, if you chant 16 rounds in the morning, you get a sense of satisfaction, right? That's pleasing your mind. That's more subtle, and your intelligence, right? And when you take a bath, let's say twice a day or 3 times a day, is that pleasing? Yes. This is a type of spiritual sense gratification, but not that you're the first enjoyer, you're the second enjoyer. Every one of these things you're doing so that you can serve the Lord nicely. Now, if you overeat, if you take very, very long hot showers, and if you sleep too much, then that's not spiritual sense gratification. Now you went back to gross sense gratification. So you see where you cross the line, where now you start doing things not because you want to please Krishna, but because you're trying to please yourself. But if you just stay within the limit of doing things in a respectable way, honoring Krishna's prasadam, Krishna's mercy, so that you can increase your service and maintain your service of regulated devotional service, and that is spiritual sense gratification. Right? As soon as you go over that line, it's gross sense gratification, because you're not really doing it for Krishna anymore. That's why Krishna says, one who eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much or sleeps too little, is not a yogi. So as soon as you get the second helping of pizza or halva or ice cream or whatever, you've crossed the line. Because that second helping is or it could be anything. It could be sex. It could be anything. That means that you cross the line. You're not doing it really for Krishna now. You're just doing it for your own sense gratification. Okay. So now the full-blown material conception of life keeps one entrapped permanently in the cycle of karma. And then eventually by having this full-blown material conception of life, that the goal of life is sense gratification and there's no limit to it. That's why people take Viagra, they get hormone therapy, this thing, that thing, so they can increase sense gratification even into old age, right? And they use all these different gadgets to increase it. So this leads to irrational, false concepts like life comes from dead chemicals. Now, it was proven long ago that life comes from life. It doesn't come from dead chemicals. And it was proven scientifically by Louis Pasteur, who was a great French doctor and scientific experimenter. The problem that he was faced with in the 1850s was that, of course, France is known for its wine, but sometimes, or many times, the winemaker would end up with vinegar. And you know, it's not the same as wine. And they couldn't figure out why this was happening. They tried to avoid it, but let's say at least 4 times out of 10, they would end up with vinegar.
Madana Manohara Kariya Ramana Virana Amala Harina Amiya Vilasa Amala Harina Amiya Vilasa Vipina Purandara Navina Nagara Govinda Madhava Navanita Tashkara Govinda Madhava Navanita Tashkara Sundarananda Gopala Yamuna Tatachara Gopi Basanahara Rasa Rasika Kripa Moya Sri Radha Vallabha Vrindavana Natavara Bhakti Vinoda Jaya Bhakti Vinoda Jaya Radha Nila Madhav Radha Nila Jaya Jagannatha Jaya Jagannatha Jaya Baladeva Jaya Subhadra Jaya Sitaram Jaya Sitaram Jaya Sitaram Jaya Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada
So first tell us what the homework was yesterday. What? Explain what?
Explain
Explain what? How to go back to Godhead. Okay, go ahead. Wait a minute. We have a microphone for Pranay? Huh? Harush, did you do any homework yesterday? No. Okay. So how to go back to Godhead. Good. That's a good homework assignment. Good.
The goal of life is to go back to Godhead. But to go back to Godhead, you need to taste the nectar of life. The steps are to understand Krishna and attain Krishna's love. That's all.
Okay, that's a good start. So you want to finish that for next week?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Understand Krishna and develop love for Krishna. Yeah, that's a pretty good answer. Yeah. So we stopped on the question of life comes from life, or does life come from dead chemicals or matter? So this was proven back in the 1850s scientifically that life comes from life by Louis Pasteur, Louis Pasteur. He's a French doctor and scientific researcher in medical science. So the problem was that, like I said, France is well known for wine, but maybe 4 out of 10 batches of wine would turn into vinegar, and that's a great loss for the winemakers. You know, of course, they could sell vinegar too, but it doesn't sell as good as wine. So the question was, why is this happening? And they couldn't figure out why. They had an idea, but they couldn't figure out. So Pasteur, previous to this, he had already figured out what's called pasteurization. Have you ever heard of that? Pasteurization? What does that mean?
Something happens to the product, changes.
No. Pasteurization is a technique to avoid that happening.
So it heats something.
Huh?
Isn't pasteurization when you heat up something?
Yes, you heat it up to a certain degree for 8 hours, and it kills off all the bad bacteria, or most of them, in milk or beer, right, or other things that are capable of fermenting, and then that fermentation would cause spoilage. So Pasteur had already experimented, and that's why it's called pasteurization. It's named after him, right? Jai Shri Radha Nila Madhava Ki Jai, Gaura Premanandi Haribol. So he proved that the spoilage of wine or beer or other things was due to particles in the air and not the air itself. Because the air can carry bacteria and germs. It's like, you know, if you're talking to someone, all of a sudden they go, "Hachoo," right in your face, right? That "hachoo" in your face, you just got a mist of germs from that person's mouth or nose, and you're going to probably get sick. Right? So these type of experiments they did supported what's called the germ theory of disease. So following his fermentation experiments, Pasteur demonstrated that wine is made from yeast, and yeast is produced from the skin of a grape. So what did he do? He sterilized grapes And by doing that, grape juice never fermented because he sterilized them. How do you sterilize grapes? You can heat them up. Or you can use some type of a solution, like an alcohol solution or something. And also, he drew grape juice from under the skin of the grape with sterilized needles, pulled some juice out of the grape. And then he covered the grapes with sterilized cloth. There would be cloth with alcohol or something on it. And both times, the grape juice did not produce wine. So now he realized it's not the air, it's something else that's causing the spoilage of wine. And his theory now that he was forming by these experiments was against the prevalent theory at that time of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation means, poof, life is produced from nothing. You can't figure out what the source is. It just happens naturally. So this was a general theory, spontaneous generation. It's very similar to scientist theory today, that life is produced from dead matter. Except spontaneous generation says it just produces like that, out of nowhere. Whereas scientists say, well, you have these dead chemicals, but there was some biological soup in the beginning of time, and then maybe at the North Pole, some direct electromagnetic waves came into the North Pole and zapped this nutrient soup, and all of a sudden there was an amoeba that formed, or proteins were formed, and then they eventually made amoebas and blah, blah, blah. So Pasteur was criticized by other scientists, and therefore these two groups, the spontaneous generation guys and Pasteur's germ theory, were different theories why there was spoilage. So what happened was that the French Academy of Sciences offered a prize to whoever could prove their theory to be true. It's a big amount of money at that time. It's 2,500 francs, which is not much today, but at that time it was a lot of money. So the spontaneous generation guys said that it's air itself that causes spontaneous generation of living things in liquids. So they performed some experiments to prove that it was air that was creating life from dead matter. But Pasteur, he disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. He placed boiling liquid in a flask. And what kind of a flask? It's called a flask with a what do you call it? A swan-like flask. So it's a flask like this, and then it gets a little smaller, and there's a tube opening, right? And then from that, the glass is blown glass. So there's a neck that comes like this and gets progressively smaller and smaller, and then it comes to a tip, it's an open tip. So air can get in to the flask, but it has to go through this swan-like loop into the bottle. And on the way, Pasteur, I think he put some type of sticky stuff so that the air could get through, but if there were any particles in the air, it would get stuck in the loop, so that only pure air could get in. So he boiled a liquid in his flask, like grape juice, and then let hot air enter the flask. So you have this swan-like flask, and then he puts liquid in it, and he boils it with fire here. And then obviously there's evaporation, and the hot air and mist goes out like that. So it's that is a type of purification, because bacteria die at high temperatures. So, and then after doing that, he closed the tip of the flask. So he still had the liquid in there. It was like grape juice. But now he basically pasteurized the loop from which air could come in. And then he closed the flask. And what happened? Nothing happened. The grape juice did not turn into wine. That didn't ferment. Because it was sterilized. And no air could get in. Then he did the same thing, but he let air get in. He opened, let's say he did another experiment where he had an open flask. And he did the same thing. He sterilized the liquid, but he let the air get in. And that fermented, but it became vinegar. So, in other words, organisms grew in it. So he did different experiments like that, and he also did it at higher altitudes and lower altitudes. Higher altitudes, even when he opened the flask, very few organisms grew in the liquid. Because when you go to higher altitudes, there's very little dust and other contaminants in the air. So nothing grew in the let's say the grape juice, natural grape juice, unless the flasks were tilted or opened. And this showed that something was coming from the outside in the air that was causing the spoilage. And he could see what those things were, because when the organisms developed in the liquid, in the grape juice, he looked at it under the microscope. He could see there were things growing. Some of those things were bacteria, some of those things were yeasts. So then he proved that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. He still didn't solve the problem of why wine turns into vinegar. So then, using his microscope, he noticed that there were things called bacteria and there were things called yeasts. And he finally figured out that the yeast that develops from the skin of grapes was what made wine. And the bacteria made the vinegar by further experimentation. So then he was able to teach the winemakers how to make wine every time by controlling the bacteria and nurturing the yeast coming from the skin of the grapes, so that they get wine every time. There was no more spoilage. And if they want to make vinegar, then he determined which bacteria makes vinegar. So these were experiments that he did, but ultimately he proved that life comes from life. If you sterilize the grape juice and put it in a closed flask where no air can get in, nothing happens. It just stays like that. But if you let the air come in, the air itself doesn't cause the fermentation. It's the particles in the air that are carrying germs and bacteria that will cause the fermentation. So, therefore, those organisms that developed in the grape juice was from living things that you can't see with the naked eye, but entering in with the air and causing the fermentation. And when you stop the air from coming in and you sterilize the grape juice and the flask, then nothing happens. It remains stable. So he proved that fermentation, development of organisms in the sterilized thing. It's coming from life entering into it through the air. Living organisms, germs and whatever, entering into the flask. So he proved that life comes from life. Now the same thing is happening all the time. Like, for example, we were talked about scientists making blood. You can't make it synthetically, but you can make it by getting stem cells from bone marrow. Most of the blood in the human body is made from bone marrow. It means you get these stem cells. These are cells that can produce blood, and then cultivating them, and that way you can produce a little bit of blood. But you're starting with stem cells, living entities from the human body. So there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. There's no such thing as life comes from dead chemicals or dead matter. So Pasteur proved this in the 1850s, and even today, the scientists that make a little bit of blood, it's not exactly equal to human blood, but it's let's say a blood-like substance that they can make from stem cells. They make it by starting with cells. Okay, so therefore, the idea of spontaneous generation was defeated by Pasteur, and the idea that life comes from dead chemicals has never been proven, or dead matter, up until today. So, due to these 5 types of ignorance we were talking about, one develops this full-blown material conception of life, and the material conception of life keeps people in the cycle of karma. And the only way to break out of it is, as Pranay said, he did his homework, you have to develop Krishna consciousness and love for Krishna. And therefore, the full-blown material conception of life is full of misconceptions. And until those misconceptions can be cleared up by hearing the Vedic knowledge, one remains in a cycle of karma. So that was today's class. Are there any questions? Yes, Pranay.
Wait, so if wine is made of... If wine is made out of grapes, then is grape juice wine?
No, like I said, wine is made from yeast that transforms grape juice to alcoholic substance called wine. And it is a type of fermentation, but it's not the same as vinegar. Bacteria produce vinegar. The yeast from grape skins produces wine. And Pasteur cleared up the confusion that was going on in 1850, why winemakers sometimes 4 out of 10 times would end up with vinegar instead of wine. And they couldn't figure it out. But he used his observation, his experimentation, and his microscope to see that it was not bacteria, but it was yeast that made wine. Okay, and then he proved also that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation, that life comes from life. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll stop there and continue again. So homework. Pranay is going to finish his homework. He already got the gist of the answer, but you're going to do some more research, right? How, and the subject is how you can go back to Godhead, right? Okay. And then also, you can explain what is the material conception of life. Okay, Arush? Yeah. What is the material conception of life? Haribol. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.